Some of the most spiritually exhausted people I know still go to church. They still believe in God. They still pray sometimes. They still love Jesus, but deep down, they feel numb. And maybe that's you right now. Not rebellious, not atheist, not running from God, just tired. Maybe you're disconnected, emotionally flat. You read the Bible, but it doesn't move you like it used to. You worship, but it feels mechanical. You pray, but it feels like your words barely make it past the ceiling. And what makes this especially difficult is that many Christians feel ashamed to admit it, because we think, if I really loved God, wouldn't I feel more? But spiritual numbness is far more common than people realize. And tonight, I want to talk honestly about it, not as someone who has everything figured out, but as someone who understands what it feels like to go through seasons where your heart feels spiritually exhausted. Because I truly believe many Christians are not walking away from God. They're just overwhelmed. And honestly, I think one of the biggest reasons people feel spiritually numb today, it's noise. Constant noise. We wake up and immediately we're checking our cell phones, notifications, bad news, politics, arguments, videos, outrage, fear, scrolling, endless opinions. And we absorb more information in one day than people used to absorb in weeks. Think about that. Our minds never stop moving. Even silence feels uncomfortable now. And here's the problem. God often speaks quietly. Not always, but often. In 1 Kings 19, Elijah expected God to appear in dramatic ways through the wind, through the earthquake, through the fire. But Scripture says God spoke through a gentle whisper. And I wonder how many believers today are desperate to hear from God while surrounding themselves with nonstop noise. And I'm not just talking about technology. I mean emotional noise too. Stress, fear, comparison, bitterness, pressure, disappointment, conflict, financial strain. The list goes on. Some people aren't spiritually dead. They're just mentally overloaded. And eventually, overload creates numbness. Your soul was never designed to carry this much stimulation all the time. I think sometimes Christians imagine spiritual warfare only looks dramatic. Darkness, temptation, obvious sin. And it does. But honestly, I think one of the enemy's most effective strategies is distraction. Because if he can't destroy your faith, he's going to try to exhaust it. If he can't make you hate God, he'll try to make you spiritually numb, because distracted Christians are weak Christians. Not because they don't love God, but because they slowly lose sensitivity to his voice. And this happens gradually. We stop sitting quietly with God. We stop meditating on Scripture. We stop praying deeply. We stop resting. And eventually, our souls become so emotionally calloused. Not overnight, but little by little. The enemy doesn't always need Christians to become evil. Sometimes he just needs us to be too busy, too angry, too distracted, too entertained, too exhausted to hear God clearly anymore. And honestly, I think many believers are running on spiritual fumes right now. And this part is important because some people watching this are carrying guilt right now. You think, if I feel spiritually numb, something must be wrong with me. Now, certainly, sin can create distance. Unconfessed sin matters. Disobedience matters. But not all numbness comes from rebellion. Sometimes it comes from grief. Sometimes it comes from burnout. Sometimes from disappointment. Sometimes from carrying pain for too long. Sometimes it can come from unanswered prayers or simply trying to survive life. Look, even biblical figures experienced deep emotional exhaustion. Here's a few. David did. Elijah did. Job did. Jeremiah did. There are moments in Scripture where godly people sounded emotionally depleted. And one of the lies that Christians believe is if I struggle emotionally, my faith must not be real. But friends, let me tell you, that's simply not true. Faith is not constant emotional intensity. Sometimes faith is simply continuing to trust God while we're feeling emotionally weak. And honestly, that's the kind of faith that may be stronger than the emotional hype. I also think we need to have an honest conversation about what constant digital consumption is doing to us spiritually. Because social media trains us to crave speed, novelty, outrage, comparison, and constant stimulation. But spiritual growth usually happens slow, quietly, deeply. And that creates tension because Scripture requires meditation, it requires reflection, stillness, patience. But our 2026 modern life conditions us for instant emotional reactions. We scroll past tragedies in seconds. We consume pain as content. We move from worship music to political rage, to comedy clips, to bad news, all within minutes. And eventually, our emotions just flatten. We stop feeling. Not because we're bad people, but because we've overloaded our nervous systems. This reminds me of an old Andy Griffith episode. I love Andy Griffith. This episode was titled Man in a Hurry. And if you've watched it, you remember it because an uptight, wealthy businessman named Malcolm Tucker gets stranded in Mayberry when his luxury car breaks down on a Sunday. In a massive rush to get to Charlotte, North Carolina, he's baffled and he's infuriated by the town's laid-back, leisurely pace, especially since everything is closed on Sunday and no mechanics working. Eventually, Tucker's forced to spend the evening sitting on the front porch with Andy, Barney, and Aunt Bee, and slowly the stress wears off. He enjoys a home-cooked meal, joins in a song, and realizes the frantic rat race isn't as important as he thought. And I genuinely believe many Christians today are not spiritually starving because God abandoned them. I think they're spiritually exhausted because they never unplug long enough for their souls to breathe. And this is the part that I really want someone to hear tonight. If you feel spiritually numb right now, God has not abandoned you. Feelings are real, but feelings are not always a reliable indicator of God's presence. Some of the deepest seasons of my faith have felt incredibly quiet. Sometimes God does his deepest work in silence. And sometimes emotional numbness becomes the very thing that drives us back toward dependence on him. Because eventually we realize the world can't heal what the world created. More entertainment won't fix it. More scrolling won't fix it. More distraction won't fix it. Look, our souls were made for something deeper, for truth, for peace, for communion with God, not constant noise. And if you feel distant from God right now, maybe the answer is not trying harder. Maybe it's just slowing down enough to hear him again. I think there are many Christians right now who feel spiritually numb, but they haven't lost their faith. They've just been carrying too much for too long. And maybe tonight, instead of condemning yourself, you simply need to slow down. Breathe. Be still. And remember that God is often closest in the quiet moments we almost miss. Not every season feels emotionally powerful. But numbness does not mean God is absent. And exhaustion does not disqualify you from his grace. So if this video found you in a difficult season, I hope it reminded you of something simple. God has not forgotten you, even here, even now. Thanks for being here tonight. If you haven't watched that Andy Griffith episode, go check it out. It might just remind you of where we are at times when we're so connected to God and where we are other times when we're too busy. God bless.